Now we can delve into that first sublecture, which is entitled The Introduction, Counsel for Kings and Courtiers in Quest of Magnificence. It spans, as you see there, the first 12 verses of Proverbs 25. Let's begin by reading this sublecture. Chapter 25, verse 1. These too are Solomonic proverbs, which the men of Hezekiah the king of Judah arranged. The glory of God is to conceal a saying, while the glory of kings is to search out a saying. Skies extend to the heights, the earth extends to the depth, but the mind of kings is unsearchable. Removal of dross from the silver, thus a vessel emerged for the refiner. Removal of a guilty person who is before a king, thus through morality may his throne be established. Do not put on airs before a king, and in the place reserved for people of prominence do not stand. For it would be better if he were to say to you, "Come up here," rather than demoting you in the presence of a prince, someone whom your eyes regarded. Do not be in a hurry to argue a case. What can you do afterward when your neighbor puts you to shame? When involved in litigation, you must concentrate on your own case against your own neighbor. Do not take up in public what is actually someone else's personal concern. Else, one who hears may shame you, and the evil report about you would not go away. Golden apples within silver carvings, such is a saying said in the setting proper for it. A golden ring and an inlay of rare gold, such is one who wisely reproves a listening ear. As usual, it will be important to appreciate the structural features that lend cohesion to this particular portion of Proverbs. Already we have studied 5 structural features that operate at the high altitude level of the master lecture, joining parts of chapter 25, 6, 7, 8, and 9 together. Those involved the master lecture's 4-part structure, which revolved around the unifying question with 3 answers. It also involved noticing how those 3 answers form a cohesive whole. And finally, the last 3 of those 5 at the master lecture level considered evidence for 3 perspectives or themes that infuse these 5 chapters, namely the monarch's perspective, the courtier's perspective, and the theme of magnificence. Now we'll turn our attention to 6 macrostructures that are housed right within this first sublecture. The first involves a chiastic arrangement of the first and second expanded answers when compared to how they appear in the condensed introduction. Notice Roman numeral 2, which spans verses 4 through 12, and then close in on subpoint A. Here is counsel for kings. It appears before subpoint B in the introduction, which is counsel for courtiers. However, when we proceed outside of this sublecture and encounter the expansion of these relative parts, we find that the sage will first expand on counsel for courtiers. That starts in 25:13. And then he'll come back to counsel for kings in the expanded form in the last sublecture. That last sublecture begins in 28:1, with special attention to kings starting in 29, verse 3. This is what we mean by saying there's a chiastic arrangement. In the introduction, it's kings followed by courtiers. In the expansion, it's courtiers followed by kings. The second macrostructural feature involves anticipation of the term guilty and the term moral together as a word pair in later sublectures. 7 times within the sublecture spanning 28:1 through 29:7, that's the fourth sublecture, the sage will refer to both guilty and moral or morality within a single verse. And he will do it in such a way that guilty will occupy one hemistich and moral or morality will occupy the other hemistich. When we come to the discussion of that particular sublecture, we'll see that those 7 verses appear at structurally significant junctures within sublecture 4. The sage anticipated the strategic role that that word pair would play by embedding that same pair early on here in the introductory sublecture. In particular, embedding it within the teaching for monarchs. Notice verse 5. Removal of a guilty person who is before a king. Thus, through morality, may his throne be established. Guilty is in the first hemistich, morality is in the second. The sage has purposely introduced that word pair relative to the monarch, and he will revive it when we come to the monarch's expanded passage. That's the fourth sublecture, starting in 28:1 and going on through 29. When we encounter it there, he will use it like a refrain 7 different times at strategic points. We simply want to call attention to the fact that he embeds that word pair relative to the monarch right here in the introduction. Third is an inclusio involving the word glory. If you'll notice toward the end of the fourth sublecture, that is 28:1 through 29:27, the sage compresses the bulk of his teaching into a single character summary. And here we're focusing on 29:23. reads, a mortal's loftiness will bring him low, but it is lowness of spirit that will lay hold of glory. Aside from a 4-verse conclusion, which immediately follows, 29 verses 24 to 27, that character summary comprises the master lecture's last teaching, very significant in its positioning. The impact of that character summary, with its line terminal reference to the word glory, increases substantially when it's linked to the first wisdom content of the entire master lecture, namely 25 verse 2, where we read, the glory of God is to conceal a saying, while the glory of kings is to search out a saying. The master lecture thus achieves a remarkable degree of inclusio, with line initial use of glory in 25:2a and line terminal use of glory in the toward the close there in 29:23. Fourth is closure, involving a Hebrew root that means to demote or to mean lowness. The root is shafal. It means to be low or to make something low, to demote. And it appears in only 2 verses across the entire master lecture, once in the introduction and again toward the close. Within the introduction, the sage's first advice to courtiers expresses a warning lest they be demoted by presuming greedily to occupy an exalted station when they haven't been invited there. We have in mind here verse 7 of chapter 25. For it would be better, the sage says, if he were to say to you, come up here, rather than, here's the key word, demoting you in the presence of a prince, someone whom your eyes regarded. This word or root, shafal, will not appear again in this master lecture until we come to 29:23, where it enjoys not just one use, but double use, both the expression bring low and lowness. And this appears just prior to that 4-verse conclusion, 29:24-27. There in 29:23, it reads, "A mortal's loftiness will bring him low, but it is lowness of spirit that will lay hold of glory." The verse we saw in connection with the previous structural comment. By employing the root shafal not once at the conclusion, but doubly there in 29:23, the sage creates a significant degree of closure surrounding this teaching, the hazard of self-promotion and the teaching of the value of humility, which comprise themes that undergird the entire lecture. By observing this structure, then, we are able to recognize that 29:23, this teaching about lowness and self-arrogation and so forth, this looms as a very, very large teaching in the whole master lecture. The 5th macrostructure involves double mention of various terms within a single verse. In the first line following the editorial introduction, the sage twice employs a device that will recur multiple times across the master lecture. That device involves the use of a given term twice within a single verse. So notice in 25:2, the term glory occurs twice, and so also does the word saying. In 29:23, a verse we looked at recently, low or lowness occurs twice. Also enjoying double usage are the terms appetite in 27:7, face and mortal both occur twice in 27:19. The verb to be satisfied is twice in 27:20 and also twice in 28:19. The word law is twice in 28:4, and the last verse of the entire master lecture, 29:27, expresses the word loathsome twice. It's worth pointing out that these double uses are distinct from a feature known as paronomastic reduplication, which is a Hebrew syntax or idiom, which we find, for example, in to litigate a litigation. That's 25:9. We're not counting that one in this double use. Or 25:11, to speak a speech. Rather, we're concentrating on double uses where a word is used twice apart from this paronomastic reduplication. Several of these double uses, interestingly enough, occur either at the start of a connected portion. You'll find that in the following: 25:2, 27:19, 28:4, and 28:19. Or alternatively, appearing at the close of a connected portion. There are two of these, 29:23, and then, as we've mentioned, the last verse of the entire master lecture, 29:27. This suggests that the sage employs this device of doubling intentionally to signal structural significance within this master lecture. The last macro structure we'll look at, number 6, is development of thought. Here we will walk through a significant portion of this first sublecture in order to sense how the thought grows. The teaching that spreads across Proverbs 25, 1-12 consists of two parts: a wisdom commendation that is aimed at monarchs. You see that on the screen. Section 1, labeled Wisdom Commendation, the connection between wisdom, monarchs, and magnificence. This spans verses 1-3. And then, secondly, counsel for kings and courtiers. This is section 2, beginning in verse 4 and extending to 12. So you see the title, section 2, Counsel for King and Courtier to Achieve Magnificence. Section 1 opens with an editorial note attributing these wise sayings to Solomon, admittedly with the help of King Hezekiah's staff. That's verse 1. Thereupon, the sage establishes the true nature of magnificence. He anchors this early on in the master lecture. Magnificence consists neither of opulence nor of influence. Rather, magnificence is evidenced first by the sophisticated skills necessary to conceal wisdom. That's God's role, verse 2a. When it comes to the monarch's role, verse 2b explains the nature of magnificence through a word play. Initially, this hemistich teaches that monarchical magnificence consists of ferreting out the wisdom secluded by God. Upon reading on into verses 4 and 5, and reading on into the corresponding expansion, which is 29, 3 through 14, it then would dawn on the pupil that the monarch achieves magnificence as he or she not simply ferrets out clever sayings and truths about life, but more particularly ferrets out the facts concerning criminal allegations, and then proceeds to root out wrongdoing from the realm. Woven into that initial teaching, verse 2, is the tacit reminder of the supremacy of God and the subordinate role of monarchs. Very important how the sage locates himself or the monarch within humanity relative to deity. Lest courtiers, that is, subordinates to the monarch, would infer that monarchs therefore play a merely incidental role subordinate to God, the sage hastens to add in verse 3 that monarchs operate without human peer as far as wisdom capability is concerned. Waltke points out in his commentary that verses 2 and 3 serve to establish the descending hierarchy beginning with God and then king and then subjects. A useful insight. After establishing that wisdom supplies the means to magnificence, then in section 2, the sage explains what steps one should take to achieve that magnificence. This spans verses 4 through 12. The sage will address in turn both the king, that's block 2a, verses 4 to 5, and then courtiers, block 2b, verses 6 through 10. The sage closes by underscoring the fundamental importance of reproof, which constitutes that bitterest but most beneficial form of wisdom. That will be block 2c. It's labeled here reproof, counsel for kings and courtiers alike. A monarch who is keen on expanding his magnificence, rather than merely maintaining the status quo comfortably, must pursue a policy of courageously maintaining moral order. He must confront wrongdoing and eradicate it from his kingdom. That's the message of block 2a, the Counsel for Kings, verses 4 and 5. To do so will improve the magnificence, the luster of the realm, just as removing impurities from silver ore will enhance its gleam. Only then can silversmith and monarch alike make something of beauty from the raw materials entrusted to them. In a later sublecture, the sage will turn from silversmithing to animal husbandry for a metaphorical model of management to which a monarch should aspire. That comes in the third sublecture, 27-23 and following. And so we see that within verses 4 to 5 of 25, the sage establishes metallurgy as a metaphor for achieving magnificence, because metallurgy requires removal of undesirable elements, and that's the job of the king. Since the success of the realm rests on more than the monarch alone, the sage next turns to address courtiers. This occupies block 2b, verses 6 to 10. Like their king, courtiers also entertain thoughts of achieving advancement. thoughts of magnificence. According to the sage, courtiers' dreams of greatness may go wrong in two ways. We can see those two ways summarized in the heading 2b on the left side of your screen. Counsel for courtiers. We're indicating this is a dual theme presentation of topics. On the one hand, self-control concerning greed, and on the other hand, shrewdness concerning generosity, all in the quest for magnificence. Let's consider these a little more carefully. So it may go wrong in two ways. First, the courtier may go astray due to a sense of greed that causes the courtier to notice colleagues in superior positions and then emptily boast of their own prowess, or to presume to join those circles which are beyond their proper station. That is the hazard of greed in verses 6 and 7. The second hazard, through this we see that even a sense of generosity can lead the courtier astray. For he may be sucked into wrongly advocating on another's behalf. This comes through verses 8 through 10. The individual who is asking the courtier to advocate for him may be unworthy, whether an irresponsibly stupid fellow, a persistently indolent fellow, or worse yet, a seductively litigious person who has grown blind with revenge, unable to perceive true justice. So when we say that these persons are unworthy, we're not saying that they are too simple or too poor. We're saying they have poor motives, or they would be irresponsible. It's like sending out a reference letter for someone who is just thoroughly irresponsible or unqualified. They are unworthy of the reference letter, is what we're saying. Incidentally, this hazard of hasty advocacy becomes clearer when the sage will expand this dual theme point when he arrives at chapter 26, verses 1 through 28. And it is from that passage that the three samples have been drawn, namely the irresponsibly stupid fellow, a persistently indolent fellow, or the seductively litigious person. Those three the sage parades in chapter 26. After answering the question concerning acquiring magnificence, first with instructions to the king, that was verses 4 and 5, and second with instructions to the courtiers, verses 6 to 10, the sage closes the introductory sublecture with a third answer, an answer which will be relevant to king and courtier alike. Since wisdom is the true currency of magnificence, the sage established that back in verse 2. Then in verses 11 to 12, here at the close of this sublecture, we shouldn't be surprised to find that the route to true splendor, which in that quatrain is likened to a goldsmith's glittering craftsmanship, that route is marked by nothing less than wisdom's most prized commodity, namely reproof. To be effective, the sage explains that such reproof must be accompanied by two perspectives or skills. First, it must be dispensed with proper attention to settings, timely communication. That's verse 11. And second, that reproof must encounter a receptive listening ear. That's verse 12. These are the ways, then, that the macrostructure of development of thought demonstrates that this sublecture, Proverbs 25, 1 through 12, is carefully constructed, moving from anchoring the goal of magnificence, locating God and king in that process, delivering instructions for kings, delivering instructions for courtiers, and then underscoring the importance of being receptive to reproof that is ably delivered. In the final portion of this video lecture, we'll consider microstructures and then draw some closing implications concerning the enduring message of this sublecture.